Okay. All right. So we're going a bit deeper into this balancing system of the body. So to begin with, we're going to go through the nervous system a little bit before really diving into the brain in excruciating detail. So to begin with, let's talk about the nervous system. Okay, the nervous system as we know it. The nervous system. So the nervous system is made up of two things. It is first made up of the CNS, okay, and then it is made up of the peripheral nervous system. Horrible handwriting. The peripheral nervous system. So with those two in mind, it is made up of these two. Okay. So the CNS, the central nervous system, is made up of two parts as well. So this is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So the central nervous system is the one that brings the actual response that we have. Okay, these are our control centers. Okay, whereby the brain has to actually reason to bring a response. Okay, for you to actually lift up your hand and say the correct answer, or so on and so forth. So this is something that the brain is responsible for. You have to reason this before you do it, like so. And then the spinal cord has to bring non-voluntary actions, okay, like removing your hand from a hot stove when you're cooking, for instance, and so on and so forth. So the spinal cord brings that response, okay, and then like so this is the central nervous system. It brings those responses. Okay, remember, this nervous system it's a whole system of nerves. Okay, many nerves. Okay, and these nerves, they're all networked in the human body. Okay, they're networked throughout the human body, and these nerves, they branch from one to another. Okay, and if you look them under a microscope, we have a single unit called a neuron. Okay, called a neuron, and these neurons, they transport this impulse. An impulse, really, it's just an electric signal. Okay, it's just an electric signal. It's just a zap. All right, it's an electric signal, and these neurons, they are specifically built to transport these electric signals from one to the other between these systems. Right, so we've got our central nervous system, and then we've got our peripheral nervous system. And really what this peripheral nervous system does is that it just brings the signal to the muscles. Okay, so this peripheral nervous system is actually the one that branches out through the rest of the body, while the CNS is just the brain and the spinal cord. They've got those branches that end up going everywhere else, and they are also made up of their own. They're made up of what is called the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So we've got our autonomic and our sympathetic, and then of course there are parasympathetic nervous systems, and so on and so forth. But really what we're going to be dealing with more is this part. But before we do that, let's really look at how these impulses will travel on. So let's see how these responses work. So to begin with, first we have what is called a receptor. A receptor. So what a receptor does is that it changes what is called stimulus into impulse. So it will take a stimulus, and what a stimulus really is a stimulus, it's a certain change in the outer environment. Okay, for example, being stabbed, that's a change because your skin was in one form and then now it's damaged. So that's a stimulus. It's just a specific difference or a specific contact of some sort that happens to your body. So what a receptor does is that it will receive the stimulus, and then it will change this stimulus into what is called, you guessed it, impulse. That is what a receptor does. It will change it into impulse, and now impulse is now in the form in which that we can transport it to our central nervous system, and then our central nervous system will think it through or just respond back if it's the spine in this case. All right, so now let's look at these things that transport them. So you have to know the structure of the sensory neuron. Okay, so remember, these nerves are made up of neurons, and these neurons, we've got types. So the first type that we have is the sensory neuron, okay, followed by connector neurons, and then we've got interneuron, and then lastly we've got a motor neuron. So these are the types. Okay, this one has a more easy to see type of graphical representation. So how does it really look like? So if you look at a neuron, it looks somewhat like this. Somewhat like that. Okay, give it a bit of detail, and it's got cells, myelin sheath, like so, and let's give it a little something there. All right, like that. So our impulse travels in that form. Okay, this is how our impulse goes. Okay, so it will start from there and end up there. So it's first collected at these finger-like thingies there, and what these are called is they are called dendrites. So the dendrites will receive the impulse from one synapse gap to the next, from one neuron to the next. So they receive the impulse, and this cute looking thing it's just the nucleus, because these things are actual cells. Okay, so nucleus, and then this will travel down this structure here, and the name of that structure is called an axon. Okay, so it will travel, the impulse will then travel down the axon, and this axon is protected by what is called the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath will protect this impulse from escaping. Okay, in this myelin sheath, you have to note that it is made from Schwann cells. Schwann cells, the worst handwriting on the planet, protected by those Schwann cells. Okay, Schwann cells, and then note that these myelin sheaths, there's a gap in between them. Okay, there's a gap in between them, and that gap, we do have to know the name of that gap, and the name of that gap, it's called the nodes of Refir. Okay, so it will travel down like so until it gets to the terminal branches, and from the terminal branches it will jump off into the next neuron like so. Right, so the impulse works in this manner repeatedly. Jesus Christ, what is going on? Okay, quit if you'd like. Okay, so it happens in that manner. Let me open that again. Come on. Oh, beautiful. Okay, hell no, absolutely not. Okay, so what we have entirely are a network of similar neurons to the one that I have sketched, with all having dendrites, axons, and nodes of Refirs, and so on and so forth. So you have a whole network of these. So one thing that keeps them, the one interesting thing rather, is the fact that these things, they never touch. Okay, so these neurons, they never really touch. Okay, and you're probably asking, well, then how does the impulse get to the next one, man? I mean, come on, like what's the catch here? So what you actually have is you've got that dude, that's quite thick. So you've got one like that, like so. It goes on and it has its terminal branches, and then I'm not gonna draw it touching, but rather from a distance, like so, and like that, and then you'd have another one after that, and so on. So, and then of course I've forgotten my my lean sheath, like so. Okay, so they do not touch. So the way in which the impulse is able to jump from one neuron to the other is it utilizes what is known as a synapse gap. A synapse. So a synapse occurs like that. So you have one terminal branch from one neuron and a dendrite from the other. Okay. So in this synapse gap, you're going to have what are known as neurotransmitters. Okay, those are neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters will be stimulated from one point, and then once they are stimulated and they receive that impulse, they go to the next one, and when they are at the next dendrite, in this case, they're going to go and drop it there, and that will do the whole axon situation and go to the next neuron. All right. So this happens like that, so on and so forth, repeatedly. Okay. Oh, come on. Seriously? Again? I'd kill myself. Okay. So they utilize these synapse gaps to bring out that the transportation. So these neurotransmitters are not really are the ones that are able to carry that impulse from one to the other. It's sort of like sending one person to another person to deliver a message, and then what would happen is these neurotransmitters would then come back to their original neurotransmitter and wait for the next impulse. They happen in that manner. We do not necessarily have neurotransmitters that are permanently staying, or rather sitting at a dendrite of a neuron. They actually have to continuously move in that manner. Okay. So with this in mind, we will then start looking at the brain. That was a quick revision. Not quite everything, of course. So what I need there, the nervous system. So we've mentioned that the nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system is the one that takes the impulse to all the other parts of the body that is not the brain and the spinal cord. But you are ganglions. Well, don't worry about that. Your exam will not have much to do with ganglions, but you do need to know the nerves that we're talking about, which composed of those sensory neurons, interneurons, connector neurons, and motor neurons. Bless me. So with these in mind, we're going to then look at how the brain really works and what are the parts of the brain. Okay, so the brain is made up of two hemispheres. Okay, the left and the right hemisphere. So these two hemispheres are able to communicate with one another because of what is known as the corpus callosum. So this corpus callosum connects the left and the right hemisphere of the brain, and it brings the communication between those two hemispheres of the brain. Okay, and then towards the front of your brain, actually have a big one, is the cerebrum. The cerebrum brings the cognitive high process reasoning and basically that high capacity thinking. Okay, that is done at that cerebrum. The voluntary actions, the actual thinking, does at that cerebrum. Okay, the interpretation of sensations, touch and so on, that happens in the cerebrum. Okay, then towards the back as you go, okay, you're gonna come across the hypothalamus. Now really, the hypothalamus, we knew this previously as a gland basically that would secrete hormones. And yes, and one of those hormones you went through were the ADH, right, the antidiuretic hormone, which was the one that controls the water levels, isn't it? And that's really what the hypothalamus does, is that it controls sensations, okay, like hunger, thirst, sleep, high temperatures, emotions, and so on and so forth. This is all within that hypothalamus. It really does the work there. Okay, and then towards a little bit at the back, we've got the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has to do with coordination. So it coordinates. So when you're talking coordination, we're talking about balance, we're talking about movement, we're talking about muscle toning and tension. Okay, so all that balance, all that coordination, where am I stepping type of stuff, that is all regulated and controlled by that cerebellum. And then the most famous one, which everybody knows, is the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata has to bring that cardiovascular system. It deals with the heartbeat. Okay, so it also transmits nerve impulses between the spinal cord and the brain. Okay, because we should be in the position to know that the brain and the spinal cord are pretty much one and the same structure, and thanks to the medulla oblongata. And once again, as I've mentioned, the cardiovascular system is all governed and controlled by that medulla oblongata. And our best friend, which we knew previously, was our pituitary gland. Okay, and the pituitary gland, we knew that this is the master gland that secreted a very large number of hormones in the females and in pretty much both parties. All right, then what we need to know about Uncle Brain here is the fact that he is surrounded by a fluid. Okay, the brain is surrounded by a fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. So this cerebrospinal fluid we're talking about does not only surround the brain, but it also surrounds the spine as well, as hence it says the cerebrospinal fluid. It surrounds both the brain and the spine, and it's there within the spine. It is there as a lubrication for that spinal motion that we have there. Okay, and it also serves to protect those. Okay, so it pretty much serves to protect the central nervous system. Okay, and Uncle Brain here is surrounded by this membrane of muscles called meninges. Okay, now these meninges, they also serve to protect Uncle Brain here, because he is one of them, the most precious organs that we have, because that's pretty much the CPU of the entire body structure. Okay, so these meninges, they are there for that. So if you're suffering from meningitis, then you are going to have very low processing type of thing, because you are at risk of having your brain damaged. Okay, now let's talk disorders. So the key disorder you need to know with the brain is dementia. Dementia, or if you want to look at it, you can look at it as Alzheimer's. So what happens is, with dementia, you would forget very regular activities like wearing your socks or opening the door. You would forget those basic stuff. Okay, so you would somewhat have things from your long term lost. Okay, in fact, that is astigmatism I'm talking about. Okay, so you would forget such. Okay, and one of the causes was the meningitis that I spoke about, and it also comes through time as well as you grow older. And then you have the dementia, where you would have a short-term memory loss, something that you just heard now you can forget now. You can walk into a room and forget that you are in a room, for instance. So it is a short-term memory loss. All right, like so. So those are the disorders that are associated with the brain that you do have to know. Now when you look a bit broader to it, if you look at the entire nervous system entirely, with those two you would have the disorders like multiple sclerosis as one of them. Multiple sclerosis being whereby your neurons will not have a well-functioning myelin sheath. So remember, the myelin sheath protects the impulse from being lost out of the neuron. So without that myelin sheath, you would lose it. So basically, if you have that multiple sclerosis, your neurons are sort of working, but the impulse is lost. So you can either not receive sensation, or you cannot give a response to certain sensations, like touch. You can touch but not feel anything, okay? Or you can touch something hot but not be able to give a response to move away your hand, basically because your reflex action is not complete in that manner. All right, so those are some of the disorders that are associated with the nervous system, and we will look deeper into detail moving on.